Good afternoon. This is session 3 of my mini lecture series on African American women singers who had an impact on the civil rights movement. So yesterday we did Nina Simone, and one of the people she looked up to most was Billie Holiday. So Billie was referred to as Lady Day by a great saxophone player, Lester Young. She called him Prez, and that's how she got that name. She referred to herself as torch singer, and she was, very much so. I'm a sucker for a blues ballad, and she was the best at those, I think, for sure. She was born in 1915 in Philadelphia. She was raised in Baltimore, Maryland, which had a strong jazz scene. She fell in love with the music at an early age and actually took a job scrubbing floors so that she could borrow the Victrola, because of course she couldn't afford one, right? And listen to Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, which were her inspirations. So her story is, wow, it has a not so happy ending, but she left us a legacy of music that can lift our hearts and spirits for decades and centuries to come. So let's start with her around the 1930s. I'm going to say this. She was a vocalist and a songwriter. And for me, I was introduced to her music in my 20s, so around the year 2000. And her voice touched me like nobody else's ever has. There was something about the tone of her voice. Most people, when they talk about Billie, they talk about her phrasing and the emotion in her voice, and both of those things are very true. But for me, she had sort of this phantom-esque tone that she used. It was, I don't want to say hollow, but it was very haunting, and it stayed with you. And as I would listen to her music, I would just sort of be pulled in, and I would want to reach out and touch it. And yet the tone and the phantom-esque quality was that it would just sift right through your fingers. And so as much as you wanted to hold on to it, it just moved through you, right? And then it was gone. I loved that she milked everything out of every single note and word. And she held on to this part of her phrasing, I think that they're talking about, right, is she held on to those notes, and she sort of elongated everything, and that pulled you in. She was exceptional. If you have not heard her before, then by all means go to YouTube and do so now, right? She was also a songwriter, even though she didn't read music at all. And she was very good at both. You may recognize a few that I'll tell you about now. Don't Explain. Hush, lover, don't explain. You're my pleasure, you're my pain. She was much better, of course. Lover Man, Lady Sings the Blues, Now or Never, and God Bless the Child. The latter was very popular. It was a hit for her. So she began singing in Harlem in small jazz clubs that had just a piano player, and she would go sit in. And somebody came in one night that heard her and was impressed and was in the music business. And they introduced her to Benny Goodman. And at the time, Benny was trying to find his own sound to make him stand out. It was the big band era. There was lots of competition. Glenn Miller was the man. And Benny played clarinet. And he, in an effort to come up with his own sound, started using a clarinet lead, which was very unusual in big band music. He got lucky with Billie because her voice complemented that clarinet in a way that I don't think anybody else's would have. And they were a great combination together. Just fantastic. They recorded a couple of tunes. The first one that was a hit was Riffin' the Scotch, Riffin. That was big. Billie was only 18 at the time. And then I think the next year she hooked up with the Teddy Wilson Orchestra. And they did 95 recordings together. So they did a lot. She had kind of a hard time because this era didn't allow for a vocalist to really tell a story with her song. What you were finding was that brass players would have lots of solos. So she may sing a couple of lines, not even the entirety of a verse, and then have 4 or 5 different instruments do solos before she's back into the chorus or the second verse. And it sort of took away from the emotion and the storytelling of the song. She ended up recording in 1936 with her own orchestra. And she had several hits. Summertime was number 12 on the pop charts. And I think almost everybody knows Summertime. Ella Fitzgerald recorded that. Nina Simone did later. It was a very popular song, and she did well with it. This led her into her peak year ever, which is considered to be 1937. She had 16 best-selling songs, including Carelessly and I've Got My Love to Keep You Warm. The latter was recorded by several artists during that time, the most popular probably being Fred Astaire, which I just find adorable. She toured with Count Basie in 1935. They recorded What a Little Moonlight Can Do. And it was put into a film, a live recording of her singing with the Duke Ellington Orchestra that was called Symphony in Black. And I think it was finally put out in 1955. So you can find that if you would like to watch it and see Billie Holiday singing live with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, which I think would be a treat. She went on in 1936 to, I beg your pardon, it was 1936, not the previous year, that she had started recording with her own orchestra. So I messed that date up for you. I want to clarify that. Let's move on to 1938, when she toured with Artie Shaw's orchestra, and she was the first African-American woman to tour with an all-white band. And that proved very difficult for her regarding housing. So she got frustrated with everything that entailed and ended up back in New York. So she would work the jazz club circuit in Manhattan and Harlem. And she had a gig at a little place called the Cafe Society, which was in Manhattan. And she was introduced to a poem there that I think they brought to her wanting her to sing it. And music was written for her, and it produced the very famous tune, Strange Fruit. If you aren't familiar with this song, it is graphic and intense. I won't even sing the lyrics to you. I will communicate to you that it's about lynching and what was happening in the South during that time. And it was a political statement, nothing less. It was very brave of her to do this. This is considered by scholars of the Civil Rights era the first song about what was happening. And it sort of fueled a movement, if you will. She sang that song at every performance she gave. She always closed out her performances with that song. And it didn't matter if she was singing to a black audience or a white audience, or if they were mixed. It was her personal anthem. And it was her way of saying what's happening in America is not okay. Jim Crow is not okay. We can't allow it to happen. It was so brave of her. I mean, she could have lost everything in her career, right? She could have had doors shut to her, but she didn't. She sold 1 million copies of it. She had a contract with Columbia Records at that time, and they said, no, thank you. We don't want you to record that here. They were kind enough to let her out of her contract for one recording, and she put it on a single. And she went over to an independent record label called Commodore Records, and they recorded it for her. And I often wondered if Columbia executives sort of kicked themselves in the derriere because that one could have made them a lot of money, right? Interesting, but it didn't hurt her to record at a different studio at all. So that kind of led her into almost a darker time in her life. This is about the time that she became addicted to heroin. And things went downhill from here. It's hard for me to talk about because I love her music so much, and I adored her for almost a decade before I explored her history and realized what had happened to her. I intentionally waited to get into the story before I shared this because I didn't want people to take just this away from Billie Holiday. But when she was a child, she had an absentee father and she was living in immense poverty. It was a very difficult time, and she started skipping school. And in Baltimore, Maryland, they would bring you and your parents into court for truancy, and they did. And because she had a single mother and she was very poor, they took Billie from her mom and they put her in a home for Black girls that were troubled called House of Good Shepherd. And she was there from January of 1925 through August of that year. And while she was there, she was sexually abused. And I'm not sure if that's why she was ended up being sent back to her mother in August or not. But shortly thereafter, her mom and she moved to New York. And so that's how she ended up in Harlem. And a few years later, ended up starting to sing. Her mother was working in a home for prostitutes. I've read that on 2 different occasions, 2 different sources. So I'm assuming her mother was a prostitute, which is a leap maybe I shouldn't make. But my guess is that Billie probably wanted to get her out of that. And that was probably another reason why she started singing, to help support them. But she had a tough childhood, and it wasn't easy for her. And I think part of what we experience, the emotion, the aching tone in her voice, I think is from that pain that she experienced as a child that obviously she never worked through, that took her down the road of drug addiction and alcoholism. So that's a tragic part of her story. So the 40s started going downhill for her in that sense of the addiction. And yet at the same time, she was having great success still. Let's go into 1941 when her song that she wrote, God Bless the Child, Billboard gave year-end number 3. She was given the number 3 slot, Song of the Year. And in 1944, she was recording with Decca Records, a very prestigious record label that you may remember. Patsy Cline recorded all of her hits, Walking After Midnight, and all those that had the orchestra accompaniment. That was a big Decca thing. And while she recorded for them, she got to do 2 duets with her childhood sort of master of music, Louis Armstrong. And in 1949, they starred together in the movie New Orleans, which I'm sure was a highlight in her career. In 1952, she hooked up with a man named Norman Granz Clef with the Furvé label. Now, this man was an avid supporter of musicians. I think that he wanted to look past her drug addiction at the time and help her kind of rise out of it. And they cut over 100 songs together. So you have an idea of the magnitude of Norman's talent and passion for music. He was the mastermind behind the Jazz at the Philharmonic series. So he tried to get her back on track. In 1954, she toured Europe, which was successful. And then she appeared on The Tonight Show with Steve Allen, beginning in 1956. She did that twice. In 1947, she was arrested for possession. So by this point, I think her heroin addiction was obvious. I imagine that when photographs were taken of her or when she was performing, people could tell that she had a problem and word was getting out. She spent a year in jail after she was arrested for possession. And when that happened, because she had a record, she lost her cabaret license. So she could no longer sing in those jazz clubs, which meant she was hard up for work. Miraculously, she booked Carnegie Hall the following year, and it was sold out. I think that tells you something about her reputation as a singer and her following. I find that absolutely incredible. She went on to perform twice more at Carnegie, with the final performance being in 1956, and it was a live recording that you can buy or watch on YouTube. And it promoted her autobiography that was called Lady Singing the Blues. She also has an album titled Lady Singing the Blues. There was also a movie produced in 1972 about her life with the same title, and Diana Ross starred in that. And Diana did a phenomenal job. I can't remember if she was nominated for a Grammy or not, but she should have won it because she did a tremendous job portraying Billie in that. And you really felt her pain and sort of better understood her experience, I think, through that. I'm going to close this out with a list of her successes, some of them that came posthumously after she passed away. But I think that her gift, her vocal ability, and her songwriting ability were profound. And again, if you've never heard her, if you're not familiar with her work, I think you should look at the 30s, what she recorded in the 30s, particularly with her own orchestra. And I think that you'll be very impressed. I think she'll steal your heart, and you'll pull her out from time to time when you need to process some emotions, maybe. She's good for that. But her accolades include 4 Grammys. The first came just before she died in July of 1959. It was awarded May 4th, 1959. And she had a half dozen biographies written about her. She has a postal stamp, in case you didn't know. You can still order that through the post office, by the way. She received a Grammys Lifetime Achievement Award in 1897, and she's a member of the Grammys Hall of Fame. Time magazine gave her Song of the Century for the fruit song. It just left my head. What was the title of it? Strange Fruit. Whew. And she had one more I wanted to share with you. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000. She recorded a total of 12 studio albums during her career, 3 live albums, 38 singles, 24 compilation albums, and 5 box sets have been put out. So there's plenty of her music for you to enjoy. And please, when you remember her, think of Strange Fruit and think of her being the first woman brave enough to sing about lynching and step into the role of an activist for the civil rights movement. She was very strong despite it all. Billie Holiday, Lady Day.